concept of ALTERSEA. Thank you so much for listening the guidelines. Before playing the pre-recorded presentation of Professor Lee, I would like to briefly introduce my colleague, Catherine Scheer, who kindly accepted to be the discussant for the session. Hello, Catherine. Catherine received her PhD in anthropology in 2014 from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, where she was supervised by Professor Yves Goudineau from the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, FEO. After a teaching fellowship at the Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh, in a project entitled Manusastra, she was a postdoctoral fellow in the NGOs and Religion in Asia project at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, before joining the Institute for Anthropology in Heidelberg University as a lecturer. Catherine then joined the FAO in 2019 as a lecturer researcher. Among her publications, she edited a book with Philippe Fontaine and Michael Finer entitled The Mission of Development, Religion and Technopolitics in Asia. It's published by Brill in Leiden in 2018. She also published an article in a peer-review journal entitled Progress in Development Studies. The article was written with Giuseppe Bolotta and Michael Finer. It's entitled Translating Religion and Development, Emerging Perspectives from Critical Ethnographies of Faith-Based Organizations. And it was published in 2019. Besides being a lecturer at FAO, Catherine Scheer is also associate member of Centre-Asie du Sud-Est, which is the hosting institution for ALTERSEA. I now want to thank you for joining the session. I wish you to enjoy Professor Lee's keynote address. And before, I will give the floor to Catherine. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, and hi, everyone. I would like to start by warmly thanking my colleagues Gabriel and Trulli and the whole ALTERSEA organizers for setting up this impressive conference on an important and greatly stimulating topic, as well as for inviting me to take part in it. I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce Tania Lee, even if she does not need introduction anymore. Tania Lee is Professor of Anthropology and Canada Research Chair in the Culture and Political Economy of Asia at the University of Toronto. She has been conducting research in Indonesia's upland regions since over 30 years, if I'm not mistaken, and has been reflecting upon development, land dilemmas, and indigenous peoples' movements, among others. Her writings are of a remarkable ethnographic richness and subtlety, and of a highly stimulating theoretical sharpness and clarity. In her 2007 book, The Will to Improve, she shows the functioning but also the limits of attempts to purportedly improve livelihoods and landscapes in Indonesia over a century. She notably sheds light on how experts render social, economic, and environmental processes technical to depoliticize development, but she also pays attention to the ways in which the people defined as targets of improvement perceive, analyze, and sometimes reject this technical expert discourse. In Powers of Exclusion, which she co-published in 2011, together with Derek Hall and Philip Hirsch, the complexity of struggles for land in Southeast Asia is documented. The book emphasizes that the question is not whether or not recent shifts in land relations do create exclusions, but rather who is excluded through which means and with what consequences. After this transdisciplinary approach of land issues across the region, in her 2014 book titled Land's End, Tania Lee relied on 2 decades of research with highland inhabitants of Sulawesi to reflect on the process and the effects of privatization of common land and on related shifts in social relations. Most recently, she studied contemporary modes of governing palm oil plantations, exploring how these large and monotonous zones affect relations between those who are involved with them. A publication together with Pujo Simedi is forthcoming. The thread of politics is running across all of these and her numerous other publications. Hence, it is a great chance to welcome her today for the keynote speech of this first ALTERSEA online conference on, repeat the title, Alter Political Engagement in Southeast Asia, which aims to reflect upon, and I quote, social movements and social activism, as well as on less visible initiatives, marginal or infra-political forms of protest and resistance, and on what can be considered as social systems of political regulation. Tania Lee's talk, titled Alter Politics, and the Challenge of Articulation in Rural Indonesia, is a deeply reflected invitation for social scientists to ask what it takes for critique to emerge and to turn into a world-changing alternative creating force, but also what might be in the way of such a process. Building on her long and engaged research, she proposes a set of questions that will be of particular interest in relation to reflections on alter politics. She argues that it is not only important to explore existing forms of resistance, but also to question what might have interrupted critique and the building of alternatives. Without further ado, I will leave the screen to Professor Tania Lee, with whom we will have the pleasure to discuss after the screening of her videotape presentation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tania Lee, and it's my great honor to be invited to give a keynote lecture for this ALTERSEA conference. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy and proud to be able to share some of my thoughts on these topics with you, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. I'm just going to share briefly the title of my talk, which is Alter Politics and the Challenge of Articulation in Rural Indonesia. So the theme of the ALTERSEA conference is social movements and social activism. And the conference document draws special attention to less visible initiatives, marginal or what they call infra-political forms of protest and resistance that pass below the radar, or that are so deeply embedded in forms of everyday life and relationships that we may not recognize their political charge. I myself have not studied social movements or activism as topics of ethnographic inquiry, but I have studied embedded or infra-politics, and I'm especially interested in exploring how politics in its most embryonic expressions does or does not link up with social activism and social movements to create change at scale. And I think this is part of the thrust of the conference, to understand how these different scales and types, forms of politics articulate or connect up with one another. To undertake such an inquiry, I think it's necessary to have a working definition of politics. And I have adopted the one offered by Nancy Postero and Eli Elinoff in their 2019 article in Anthropological Theory titled A Return to Politics. They write that politics is a practice of world-making that proceeds through constellations of critique, disagreement, difference, and conflict. So unpacking this definition, the first thing to note is that world-making means change and not stasis. It means attending to the very different ways in which actors engage with each other as they seek to transform the institutions, structures, and social formulations that shape their lives. This is the alter in the conference title. Alter not just in the sense of embodying an other, but alter in the sense of seeking lives lived otherwise, an alternative to the present, a world made differently. So note also that this definition of politics as world-making starts with critique, with unease, with a sense that something is not quite right with the world as it is, a disagreement that's often felt before it's expressed in words and long before it's mobilized to effect change. Critique, as I understand it, means discovering in a configuration of power its inherent possibility for being other than it is, opening a space to configure it differently. As Didier Fassin notes in a recent essay, the term critique derives from the ancient Greek word kritikos, which means able to make judgment, stemming from another word, krinein, which means to separate or to distinguish. Similarly, in Gramsci's conceptualization, politics begins, quote, in its elementary and primitive form as a sense of distinction, of separation, in an instinctive feeling of independence, which may be lodged in common sense and in the practices of everyday life. Stepwise, what this means then is that, if critique is a sense of unease, a sense that begins with a sense that things are not right with the world, that somehow they should be or could be configured otherwise, that's the first step in politics. A critique, therefore, means exposing a formation of power to critical scrutiny and reflection. But following that, then, world making, according to this definition, means closing something down. That's how this now is how we will organize the world, stabilize its forms, and arrive at new settlements. So there are these two moves: critique, which starts with a sense of unease, a sense that the world could be or should be configured otherwise. And then the second part of world making is actually attempting to configure it otherwise, which means forging a new settlement. This now is how we will organize things. This now is how we will live. So seen in this way, settlements are not a bad thing. They enable people to live together, to form communities and organize commons. They're the stuff of social relations and institutions. So the question for politics then is, what is wrong with current settlements, and what different ones can we imagine and put in place? The fourth point I want to make about this definition of politics is the scalar question of what it means to engage in world making or to make new worlds. How does critique in its many infra and localized forms translate or aggregate or link up with movements for change that operate in different idioms and at different scales? To step from critique, which means, starting with the sense that something is not right with the world, to world making requires sharing critical insights, naming them, organizing around them, connecting up with others, and then acting to make new worlds. That's a big step. It's a huge one, from a sense of critique to effective world making. To make sense of this, I've drawn on the work of Stuart Hall, who offers a way of thinking about this in terms of the notion of articulation. So articulation meaning two things. On the one hand, to articulate, to make explicit, to give expression. And on the second aspect is articulation as in forging a connection, linking up with others to enable some form of collective action. So those two things, making explicit, articulating, and linking up or connecting, are the two things which are necessary to make politics an effective practice of world making. Most of the time, however, there is no articulation. Critics keep their insights to themselves and no connections are forged. For me, this is a crucial arena of research. We need to investigate how and why critique fails to link up so that no world-making action occurs. I call this politics interrupted, and it's been a key theme of my research. And it comes partly from the context in which I've done my work in rural Indonesia, where unfilled promises, precarious living conditions, inequality, and injustice are everywhere, and yet effective mobilization to counter these tendencies is actually not common. More broadly, in a world characterized by inequality and injustice, we might expect to encounter widespread political mobilization as different groups identify oppressive conditions and attempt to change them. Yet, in fact, is relatively rare for a critical impulse to become the basis of mass-based social movements or political parties engaged in collective attempts to, in Marx's words, grasp the reins of history and change its course. Much more often, critique remains embedded in the practices of everyday life, in quiet stubbornness, and in small acts of refusal. But why is this so? Why is it so rare and so challenging for critical insight and infra-political action to be amplified by connecting with others and aggregating across scale? So I would like to suggest that it's difficult to address this question when studying activism or social movements. those are precisely the locations where some collective attempt at world making is quite obviously going on. But in much of the world, most of the time, there is no such action. Critique is muted, no connections are forged across sites, and people have to live pretty much with the world as they find it. So for me, studying what is not happening, politics interrupted, is a crucial form of analysis. So to summarize the points I've made so far, and to make them concrete as a framework for analysis of this question of infrapolitics and social movements, I'd like to propose a set of guiding questions which enable us to examine these questions empirically. And I'm going to share these on my screen. Okay, there. So these are what I think of as some key empirical or ethnographic questions that we could use to formulate such an analysis. So the first one is, if we think about politics as a set of practices, when examined in context, is a practice that we might observe and investigate, is that practice critical, rendering a form of power visible and contestable? Or does it work within, reproduce, and consolidate existing formations of power? It's the first question we might ask. Secondly, if a practice is critical, what is the target of critique? What's the formation of power that creates a sense of unease or separation on which the critic passes judgment? Thirdly, through what practices is critique enunciated or shared? This is the first meaning of articulation, right? To actually make something explicit. Is it shared in word or in deed? Is it just evident in silence or a shrug of the shoulders, in stubborn survival, in refusal to comply? There are many ways in which critique is in fact shared without being enunciated or made explicit. Fourth, what is the social group that connects to this critique? And fifth, in what ways does a group thus assembled act to change the configuration of power it is identified as problematic? Sixth, what are the silences and the embryonic critiques that are not articulated, or that maybe they are articulated, but they do not form the basis for connection and mobilization? Or maybe they do form the basis for connection and mobilization, but they do not make new worlds. And finally, what are the practices that sustain and stabilize the status quo? So I'm going to copy these. I'll do it later. I'm sorry. Stop share for now. Okay, so those are what I am proposing as some guidelines really for empirical analysis of this question of the practice of politics and how alter politics in its infra forms connects up to social movements. So what I'd like to do now is to put this framework that I've outlined into action by using it to examine two of the sites in rural Indonesia where I've conducted research, and to see what we can learn about alter politics by using this kind of framework for inquiry. So the first scene is the one that I examined in my book Land's End. And in the corner of Sulawesi that I described in that book, I would say that the form of power that confronted the highlanders that I described was not misguided intervention, something bad being imposed on them, but it was a profound sense of isolation and neglect. This is what made them uncomfortable, uneasy, gave them the sense that something is not right here. We should not be living in this way, isolated and abandoned. They had no access to roads, to schools, to healthcare, or any of the other facilities that became broadly available to rural Indonesians during Suharto's rule. No non-government, religious, humanitarian, or political organizations took any interest in their plight. and nor was there an enemy. No migrants or corporations moved on to their land. Their main point of contact outside their highland neighborhoods was with coastal merchants who bought the forest products that they collected and the cash crops, such as tobacco and shallots, that they grew on their swidden fields alongside their food crops, corn and rice. When I first visited the Highlands in 1990, many of my interlocutors articulated, made explicit their frustration with the way they were living and expressed the desire for a kind of progress they characterized in material terms. They wanted roads, schools, better houses, clothing, and food. Their desire, I would say, that why were those the desires that they expressed? This desire was formed in the crucible of a particular history and geography and embodied experience. Highlanders who ventured down to the market on the coast were confronted with the disdain of coastal people who classified them as poor and backward and treated them badly. Village officials humiliated them in public, telling them that they should stop their practice of shifting cultivation, but offered no alternative source of livelihood. Highlanders responded to these affronts with downcast eyes, with silence, and a body language that expressed shame and embarrassment. And this was a stance quite different from the relaxed and jovial manner that the same people adopted in their mountain homes. So one could say they had a critique. It was a critique of their isolation and abandonment. They didn't express it verbally to the authorities. To the authorities, they responded with downcast eyes, but they were quite capable of articulating this, of exploring their sense of abandonment, and when talking among themselves, and also when talking to me in their mountain homes. When a new commercial crop, cacao, came along in the early 1990s, Highlanders adopted it eagerly. They saw it as a means to improve both their economic position and their social status. Cacao would give them money to improve their houses and perhaps the means to send their children to school. What was at one level simply a change of crop from shallots to cacao turned out to have transformative effects on Highland social relations. Because cacao is a perennial, it interrupted the customary land sharing system associated with shifting cultivation. Each patch of cacao the Highlanders planted meant a patch removed from the commons and rendered into private individual property as they understood it. Over the following decade, steep inequality emerged among the Highlanders as the dull compulsion of capitalist relations set in. Kin and neighbours divided into new classes, owners of capital on one side and vendors of labour on the other. Each of these classes constrained, in fact compelled, to operate efficiently in order to secure their daily and intergenerational reproduction. Some Highlanders achieved greater prosperity and security through this process, a triumph they displayed when gangs of porters carried their sacks of cacao down to the market. They earned the grudging respect of coastal folk who previously scorned them, but the same processes that enabled some people, some Highlanders, to accumulate land and capital pushed others into destitution. So the ethnographic challenge for me was to explore the common sense that enabled Highlanders to bring about this far-reaching social and economic transformation. They had, in fact, made a new world, and yet failed to furnish them with critical insights that might have enabled them to reflect on the course of this transformation and direct it differently. Like they had basically accomplished their goal of, or at least some of them, of removing their isolation. What they had done at the same time was to constitute a vastly unequal world based on private property. And my question was, where's the critique? How a critique of isolation did not transform itself into a critique of the capitalist relations, which had now been established. So that was a mystery. That was a mystery to me. That was the thing I then had to understand. My analysis delved deeply into the Highlanders' everyday practices and relations in all their creativity and incoherence. I tracked the small but crucial steps through which the social relations that prevailed in the 1990s were transformed. Remarkably to me, no one contested the concept of private property in land, because this accorded with elements of their common sense that validated personal autonomy, enterprise, and the investment of labor. What they did struggle over was who was entitled to privatize which particular plot of land, and a new critical discourse emerged among them around attempts to monopolize excessive areas of land, or what they called wanting to control it all, leaving kin and neighbors without any access. But contra Polanyi, they did not oppose the commodification of land as such. Highlanders who prospered through cacao accumulated more land by buying it up from kin and neighbors who were struggling to make ends meet. Closer to Polanyi, they did feel uncomfortable about emergent wage work relations. It felt to them uncomfortable to become a wage worker for neighbors and kin, becoming someone's coolie, as they put it. That did not fit with their sense of autonomy, the sense that they had forged through individual enterprise and hard work in the past. But much as they resented having to become the coolie of their neighbors or their kin, they actually had no means to avoid this fate. For those Highlanders who became landless, they were basically compelled to work for others. If they didn't do such work, their children went to bed hungry. So where's the critique? Where's the critical politics that comes out of this? I considered that a critical politics building upon the thread of the Highlanders' common sense that values personal autonomy and rejects structurally entrenched hierarchy. This is one of the threads of their common sense, which was quite dear to them. You know, that thread could possibly be articulated and could become a force for making the world differently in the Highlands. But it would run up against another thread in their common sense that accepted rising inequality as the normal outcome of differential skill, effort, and luck. This thread accurately reflected the old system of production in the Highlands, which was underpinned by abundant land and by a strong sense that a person willing to work hard to bring land into production deserved to reap the reward of their efforts. Like that was their kind of cultural system. That was their understanding of how someone prospered. It was through enterprise and hard work. But that old common sense did not take into account the new realities that left landless Highlanders with few ways to express the autonomy that they valued so highly, and no way to carve out their own futures with hard work and skill. Like, you may want to work hard, but if you don't have any land, you're going to be working hard for someone else and for their profit. And that hurt. They found that painful, but they actually had nothing that they could do about it. The slow, insidious, transformative effects of capitalist economic relations appeared to Highlanders and observers alike as business as usual, even as they left destitution in their wake. What then of connections? Where were the organic intellectuals or social movement activists who might have helped the Highlanders make a different kind of sense of their situation and mobilize to transform it? Basically, I found that there were none for two reasons. First, as I noted earlier, the Highlanders were profoundly isolated and they did not speak Indonesian or have any contact with media, politicians, activists, or even school teachers bringing new ideas. Their isolation did not make their society static, quite the contrary. Using their own intellectual and material resources, they had thoroughly transformed the social and economic relations governing property, production, exchange, community, and family life in just 2 decades. But isolation did limit their exposure to alternative ways of making sense of these transformations. Like, no one was supplying them a different language or a different way to make sense of, to evaluate, or even to act upon the new conditions. Secondly, even if had activists from local NGOs who were working on rural issues visited the Highlands, it's doubtful that a constructive connection would have been made. I did try to attract many of my social movement friends to go and visit these highlands with me. But on the whole, they were very reluctant to do this, because when I described this story, they said, well, the Highlanders made the wrong choice in privatizing their land, in diving into cocoa, a global market crop. Basically, they seemed to have brought their troubles upon themselves. So this was a scenario or a conjuncture in which there were no virtuous villages valiantly protecting their customs and commons, nor was there any villainous corporation imposing its will upon Highlanders. And capitalism was not a set of capitalist relations, one could say, had not been imposed on the Highlanders as an alien force arriving from the outside, but had actually emerged from their own actions. So their desires and actions then made these Highlanders unattractive subjects for social movement activists, who at that period, throughout the 2000s, and I would say still today, are seeking examples of Indigenous autonomy, of community, of sustainable food production. The idea that people would elect to dismantle their commons in favor of private property is such a big no-no in many social movement circles that it's not surprising that they could not find allies. So as a result of this, the Highlanders could not gain recognition as legitimate political actions or forge any alliances that would give them traction. So indeed, there was no redemption. I would say that Land's End was a dead end for these impoverished Highlanders, but also for activists seeking subjects worthy of support, and perhaps also for readers who prefer books that end on a hopeful note. So my book did not quite end there, as I made the argument that an ethnographic study is itself a political intervention if it accomplishes one of the goals that Gramsci set for intellectual work, which basically means to examine the common sense of a particular social group and shed light on its insights and points of confusion in order to devise new knowledge. So, that in itself, understanding how they got to the situation that they were in is itself a form of useful intellectual work. But where does this knowledge go and what does it do? In relation to my Highland interlocutors, I myself was in no sense an organic intellectual, and I was unable to locate Highlanders who were ready to express their own critical analysis of the changes that had taken place in their neighborhoods. My attempt to encourage insight among Highlanders were limited and unsuccessful. When I pointed out to my interlocutors that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, the Highlanders fully agreed with this observation, but they treated it as banal, as absolutely ordinary, and in fact, common sense. It fit too easily with their own version of common sense, which basically says those who work hard and are lucky will get ahead. It did not spur them to reflect or to act differently. As Gramsci insisted, effective politics emerges from a specific conjuncture, a place, a time, arguably the right time, in which a new kind of sense can be made and new connections can be forged. It requires intellectual and organizational resources that go far beyond those of a visiting anthropologist. Vis-a-vis economists and planners, I'm no more optimistic about the effectiveness of my work. It will not unsettle their complacent recommendations that inefficient farmers should leave the land and find somewhere else to go and something else to do. My intervention, I would say, now a few years on, has been slightly more effective in relation to social movements. Some of my interlocutors have been encouraged to grapple with the common sense of villages such as these, who are seeking prosperity through market engagement and opening the way to build social movements that start from the insights of their interlocutors, rather than starting from movement activists own knowledge about how people should live, what they should value, what they should do, or their sense that these Highland had just made terrible choices and should have retained their commons, should have retained their food production, should never have attempted to improve their situation through launching into cocoa. So perhaps my stubborn refusal to produce a redemptive narrative in which, NGOs to the rescue, or it all turns out all right in the end, could be something useful here. Excuse me. All right. So that was the one ethnographic story that I wanted to share with you, to show both that, it's not as if these Highlanders lacked any sense of critique, but the object of their critique, the formation of power that they were engaged with, was their abandonment and their isolation and their poverty. It wasn't a formation of power focused on environmental destruction or their displacement. Those things had not happened to them. So starting then, as I had suggested, we're looking like, what is the formation of power which makes people uneasy? How do they express that unease? Who mobilizes around this critique, and what do they do about it? In this case, you'd say they did mobilize around their sense that they had been abandoned, and what they did about it is they decided to plant cocoa. Then you would ask at a wider scale, well, with whom does that form of action, that form of world making, connect up? And you'd have to say, at this historical moment, social movements are on the whole not very interested in people who embrace capitalism and who seek to improve their situation through market engagement, because they are seeking interlocutors who value the commons, who value food production, and who are invested in a different set of in a different kind of vision of the future. So now I want to change tack and talk briefly about my a second research site in Indonesia's oil palm zone, which is part of my current research on plantations on the island of Kalimantan. And this presents quite a different set of ethnographic puzzles and engages a wider spectrum of actors. So in this story, there are former landholders who have been displaced by plantation schemes. There are indigenous and migrant smallholders. There are permanent and casual plantation workers. There are private and state plantations. There are managers and officials. So there's a whole lot, wider set of characters, wider set, one could say, of formations of power, engaging different sets of actors differently. The mode of research was also different in this case, because I conducted it in collaboration with an Indonesian colleague, Pujo Sumadi, and a team of our students. So for the sake of brevity, I've decided to do this part of my analysis by focusing on just one image and reacting to it, first viscerally, effectively, and then more analytically and in context, returning to the set of questions that I posed above. So now I want to share this image with you. And it is this one. So look at this picture. What do we see here? Reacting, first of all, viscerally. What we see is arguably a ruined landscape. The number of species, the life forms which are present here have been radically reduced. What the picture actually shows is a plantation of oil palms that have been injected with the herbicide Roundup so that the new palms can be planted underneath. We also see here a lone person walking on the hot, bare earth, unshaded, wearing slippers, not work boots or shoes. What this picture does for me, sort of viscerally and effectively, is it immediately begs of me the question, what has been lost? What forms of life were present before this plantation? Are there any remnants? Are there any traces? Is there anything to be recovered? What is community? Where is the commons, right? What we see here is a picture in which many things which presumably were there before have now gone and been ruined. It also begs for me a set of questions about what has been installed, what I call the infrastructural violence, which is built into the landscape. When a vast landmass is occupied by monocrops and a grid of roads, there's no need for guns or guards. Basically, the violence is built into the landscape as such. It also asks of me, what is the common sense of this arrangement? How did creating a plantation of this kind, or even injecting the palms with Roundup, how did that become common sense? For what sort of actors is the common sense and normal way of proceeding? And presumably a social group for whom notions of productivity and profit and foreign exchange and possibly even the creation of jobs are urgent agendas. It also asks me, what are the gaps? What is the discomfort? What's the point at which a landscape like this, which is saturated with power, reveals cracks and fissures, the point at which the common sense, in fact, makes no sense at all? Where is the politics? Who has a critique? What are its forms and what are its targets? What is the alternative? What alterity, what future, what new world is possible in a landscape like this? So those are, my first sets of reactions to such a picture, thinking about alter politics. Digging deeper and putting those observations in context, what else is going on here? I know from the research that we conducted that although oil palms dominate plantation landscapes, they do not, in fact, eliminate other forms of life. There are insects and fungi, ferns and lichens, grasses and shrubs that compete with palms for light, water, and nutrition. There are rats that eat palm fruit, there are snakes that eat rats and disturb plantation workers, and there are cows that workers raise to supplement their incomes. So it is desolate. None of that other presence of other life at all, in my view, redeems a scene like this, but it is to be noted. The palms in this picture had been injected with herbicide to kill them. Why? Because they were 12 meters tall, a height which is too tall to be harvested by men using a scythe, using a long pole, which is the industry's preferred low-cost technology. So what's happening here is that something which is no longer of use from the point of view of productivity and profit was being disposed of, a sensible enough or common sense practice from some perspectives. But there were other perspectives on this scene. For workers that we knew and that with whom we discussed this, who, especially those who were nearing retirement, the dead palms were a scary reminder of their own disposability. They made them feel viscerally, uncomfortable, and reminded them that they too would be cast out, perhaps even killed off, when they were no longer of use. So this scene in itself provoked a kind of a critique which they absorbed onto their own reflection on their own condition as disposable labor for the plantation. To former landholders, the Malayan Dayak people who lived in this area before the plantation, the killing of the palms in this way signaled disrespect for Mother Nature. They described to us the eerie feeling they had when driving along the plantation roads through this field of dead palms. They felt that something was quite wrong with this picture, and they made human comparisons. What they said was that the palms had given everything they could to their owners. They had provided palm fruit and profit as they were required to do. They were therefore entitled to some reward. They should be left to live their last days in peace, even if they were not productive and should not be dispatched with a needle full of Roundup. More alarmingly, for the original landholders, the new palm seedlings that workers had planted underneath the dying palms indicated something else, which was that the corporation planned to renew its concession. Villagers had hoped that when the first generation of palms came to the end of its productive life, the plantation would return to them. That was their understanding based on the initial land acquisition in 1980. But when they saw that the palms had been injected and new palm seedlings had been planted underneath, this dashed their hope and left them feeling very desolate indeed. For plantation managers, one could say the dead palms were technically correct, right? This to them is not a scene of desolation, but one of technical competence. This is what you're supposed to do when palms reach the end of their life. But for them, the seedlings that were planted underneath were an embarrassment. These seedlings were overgrown with weeds, and the horseshoe terraces on which they were planted were undersized. So right there in front of their eyes, when they accompanied us to visit this plantation, there were embedded in the landscape material signs of their own failures and deficiency. They risked to be exposed as technically incompetent or perhaps corrupt. So on that story, a young man who'd been hired by a contractor to dig the terraces told us that the contractor had colluded with the manager to bill the plantation corporation $5 per terrace, yet he only received $1.70 for back-breaking work in the heat with a hoe. So there's a backstory to the overgrown horseshoes and the unproductive new palms. Offended by what this worker saw as the manager's excessive greed, he had decided to make his terraces smaller than was required, but just big enough to keep his job. So looking at this scene, then, one could say there were many fronts of infrapolitics: embodied critique, affective discomfort. Like a great many people looking at this scene felt uncomfortable, felt that there was something very wrong with this picture. But what kinds of action and reflection followed? The casual worker digging the terraces acted alone to improve his situation. His form of action was general in the plantation, we discovered. All workers and managers stole time, and a great many stole palm fruit or money or supplies. Theft, one could say, theft of this kind, you could say this was evidence of critique. You know, why is the plantation corporation so rich while our pay is so low? But one could also say that this kind of theft is not world-making. It left the plantation as it was, and differently placed actors sought to extract some shares from it. This kind of theft could actually be seen as a mode of stabilization. Because so many people stole from the plantation, no one wanted to kill the goose that laid golden eggs. From the villagers' point of view, what did they do about it? Well, they had been contesting the presence of the plantation since day one, 30 years. But their practices of protest were occasional, mass blockades, one in 1997-98, and their main demand was concessions. Their demands were modest. They did not demand that the corporation depart. What they wanted was for the corporation to return some of their land, give them some outgrow plots, and treat them with more respect. The demand for respect, arguably, was no small matter. Villagers felt that they had made an imposed sacrifice when the plantation took over their land, polluted their rivers, and left them with nothing. But to add insult to injury, the sacrifice was not recognized as such. Managers and plantation workers treated them as irritants, as ignorant and backward people who had produced nothing and had no right to make claims, or treated them as layabouts and thieves. So what did they do about it? Their own ongoing action was theft of fruit. They also used arson as a form of protest and a source of profit. They set fire to these dead palms to catch bats and fat rats that fell out of the burning palms half dead and that were good to eat or to sell. Sometimes the falling, burning palm trees set fire to the grass and seedlings as well. Oops, was that deliberate effort to undermine the economic stability of the plantation, or was it accidental? It's hard to know on those things. Basically, to try to find a point of entry or an optimistic scenario for politics as world making, is challenging in this milieu. There is critique on multiple fronts, felt, embodied, and enacted. It's seldom enunciated, and only with the blockade did villages actually mobilize collectively. Even then, they were pacified with a few small concessions. So at this stage, living in a ruined landscape, villagers, the former landholders who still live around the plantation, would have a hard time connecting to movements for support of the commons or for customary land rights or care of the species. Some of the kind of fronts of alter politics that the organizers of this conference are especially interested in. Looking at a landscape like this, it seems to be over for those landholders, over for those villages. They may be worried about the spirit of the land and the dead palms, but it's hard to think about this scenario in terms of preservation of the commons or even recuperation of the commons. So that's the dead end, one could say, for the landholders. Like, the violence is done. It looks like this. Their fronts of action are limited at this point to skirmishes, theft, arson, blockade. Try to get some small concessions, but they don't see a way to make this world differently. How about plantation workers? They do not mobilize collectively because they do not have unions. And this is the tragic result of the anti-communist and anti-union massacres that occurred in Indonesia in 1965 to 66, and the oppression that has continued since then in multiple forms. So looking back in history, in the 1950s, plantation workers' unions were very effective in organizing collectively to improve workers' conditions and pay. This is mainly in Sumatra, which was the intensive plantation belt at the time. These workers also engaged in education to help union members understand that they were not servants or slaves, but workers who were due proper respect as vital parts of the production system. But unions and their educative apparatus, their way of articulating problems and forging connections, have not re-emerged in Indonesia since 1966. There is no effective union movement on Indonesia's contemporary plantations. There are occasional attempts to reunionize, but they're rather severely repressed and have not gained traction. So although there are cracks and fissures in the plantation's arrangements and multiple fronts of critique, there are many practices, one could say, operating over different scales of space and time that sustain the status quo. So historically, the eradication of the Plantation Workers Union, materially, the entrenchment of this kinds of landscape, the sense that it's hopeless, it's over, you cannot go back to how things were, you somehow have to adjust to the world as it is, rather than being able to imagine a world constructed differently. So to conclude my talk now, in selecting two rather dismal, I would say, and distressing examples to discuss, I've pushed to the limits of what we might hope to find or what we might identify as alter politics. Highland villagers in Sulawesi dismantled their own commons. Villagers and workers in the plantation zone have had to adapt to a bad situation. In neither case did they mobilize locally or connect laterally, with other villagers, other workers, or join up with social movements operating at different scales. Yet they had critiques. It's not as if they were passive or unaware that there was something terribly wrong with this picture. The challenge of effective politics, how to move from incipient critique to world making, is, as I have said, a huge one. And I would argue that it's easier to understand this challenge by examining sites where movement is blocked or interrupted. These are sites which I think are good to think with, and hopefully this will be useful for material for you as the discussion continues. I think on a comparative basis across Southeast Asia, there's quite a bit of difference here. Like in some Southeast Asian countries, the question of articulation, who articulates a critique, using what terms are available, what are the social movements, the political parties, the intellectual streams and currents which are around, which are available, differ quite a bit, between the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia. So I think this is a useful question to examine comparatively. And I'll just end by, a comment. One of my colleagues, Wendy Wolford, who works in Brazil and has worked with the movement, Landless Peoples Movement, when she read my book Land's End, she said, but where are the social movements? Where are the unions? Where are the cooperatives? Where are the priests? Where are the people who could be helping these people to articulate and name the source of the problem and to act upon it? And when I told them that it's not that I had simply neglected to describe them in Land's End, is that they really were none. There are no such institutions in that area. And I think people who work on social movements and who follow NGOs around see a world full of movements, a world full of potential for articulation, both making explicit and connecting. Because I've worked in places which are not, in fact, populated by such movements. It has really alerted me to the challenge of having movements be present and also to be effective and to be in a position to connect up with the embodied forms of critique that I have repeatedly noted and observed present on the ground. So I'm going to leave that there and stop this now. And I hope that this has been useful for you. Thank you for your attention.
I think that Catherine, you can give your comments right now if you wish.
Great, thank you. I was just wanting to make sure I'm not interrupting anyone. Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for this rich and thought-provoking talk in which you propose practical ways forward to study the emergence and the journey of critique, so to get a better understanding of how it turns into world-making, and in which you reflect upon the political stance of anthropologists and social scientists more generally when analyzing and writing about people's ways to deal with what we identify as injustice or inequality requiring contestation. First, a short recap of what I perceived as some key movements of your presentation. You rely on Nancy Postero and Eli Alinov's definition of politics that assembles two inextricably linked dimensions, which you present as beginning with critique, that is, as you said, a sense that something is not right and a way of seeing a different alternative configuration that then, in certain cases, that then turns into world making, meaning attempts to change the situation to configure things otherwise in alternative ways that also become settled. You emphasize the importance of paying attention to how people move from critique to world making, a move that cannot be taken for granted as you learned from your own fieldwork. You then offer a set of questions that aim to retrace the journey of critique, first of all identifying its target by the means by which it travels, the people it associates, but also and importantly, asking what is not being said or articulated, does not move and associate others, and finally does not lead to new configurations. By showing the potential political use of not only looking at situations in which world making is in process, notably via social movements, but also at failures to articulate critique and turn it into world making practices, you take an uneasy but no less engaged position. Your talk gave me a lot of impulses to think through my own research with Bunong indigenous minorities who live in the Cambodian highlands and are dealing with various forms of land loss, among others through rubber plantations. But I am not a specialist of social movements or alter politics, nor of Indonesia. And there will be surely many people who would like to exchange with you on with these more specific background, so I will just launch the discussion with 3 rather general questions. I will start with one that concerns the Highlanders' shift to cacao culture in Sulawesi. When you presented, when you talked about the oil palm plantations in Kalimantan, you mentioned the violence built in the landscape, and you described how the dead palms made to workers and original landholders also reflect upon themselves and their role. And even if the context is, of course, completely different, what about cacao? It transformed the commons into private individual property, but I was wondering whether you could tell us a little more about the role this crop might have played in the transformations of the Laoje Highlanders' social relations, or in the ways that, that they make sense of these changes. Also, and this is now going a bit in a different direction, did the appearance of cacao influence these farmers' relations to other than human agents, for example, and did such agents seem to affect people's ways to act? These were just aspects that I was wondering about. Could the exploration of such questions by any chance contribute to explain why Highland farmers seem to have favored the trend that considered that, as you said, skill, effort, and luck deserve reward over the one that favors autonomy to hierarchy that you mentioned? Or do you see other reasons for this choice? My second point concerns your affirmation that shedding light on what prevents or interrupts alternative world making can also be a way of contributing to the practice of politics as an anthropologist. This struck a chord in me as in the course of my research with Protestant Bunang who were at the forefront of struggles for indigenous rights. I sometimes found it challenging to write about the difficulties that these Christian activists encountered in the course of their struggle because they did not conform dominant images of real indigenous people. On one hand, I wanted to draw attention to what I saw as the limits of a certain way of articulating critique that risked to result in what Lucas Bessier called hypermarginalization. But on the other hand, I did by no means want to undermine people's expression of disagreement and claims to rights. So I think here it is important to ask, as you did, where the knowledge reproduced goes and what it can do. Non-redemptive narratives being, for instance, useful for social movements to engage with people in meaningful ways, rather than seeing them as unworthy subjects. A question that nonetheless continues nagging at me and concerns the role of anthropology and social sciences, more generally talking, in producing stories that nourish alternative forms of world making. The set of questions you elaborated equally applies to contexts in which critique is articulated and world making does take place, but it stays attentive to also to possible limits to the alter. So how do you see approaches calling, for instance, to specifically actualize stories that open up space for the pluriverse, as Mario Blazer suggested, or that could be defined as anthropologies for alter politics? Could one see them as an important complementary approach, for example? I hope that was not too confusing. And lastly, if there's enough time, you mentioned how your field experience influenced the way in which the questions you treat and the way in which you treat them. So could you tell us a bit more about how your long experience in Indonesia affected your theoretical approach and also the form of engagement that you have chosen? Thank you once again for your stimulating talk, and I will leave it there for now.
Thanks, thanks, Catherine, very much for your comments. Those are very big questions that do really go to the heart of everything of the talk. So I'm just going to answer them briefly and leave space also for some more specific things to follow. So the first question, the role of cacao in transforming social relations, yes, they were aware that everything had changed, but they did not attribute it to the crop. They did not attribute it to cacao. I think it's, Michael Watts has written about the problem of crop essentialism, right? They did not see it as embedded in the crop itself, this massive transformation. And that's true also for oil palm. When smallholders plant oil palm on their own fields, as an additional crop alongside their rubber and rice and other things, they see it as a useful addition to their repertoire. They don't think there's anything wrong with the crop itself. In fact, it's great. It's very lucrative, requires little labor, and can make a good income. So I think the question is really more, there's several questions, but first of all, it's not embedded in the crop itself. Are they analytical about the way that the new crop changed their social relations, in the case of cacao, by privatizing land? They were, of course, aware that it had done so, but they treated it, as I mentioned, as obvious. Like for them, when you plant a tree crop, whatever the tree is, you may plant a field of mangoes. Basically, in their understanding, planting a tree crop, a perennial, privatizes land. That's what a tree crop does. And so they were quite comfortable with the fact that that's what cacao would do. They didn't treat it as anything really extraordinary. What was different was that people were in fact planting whole hillsides of cacao, whereas no one ever planted more than a few dozen mangoes, right? So it was the same practice, but practiced at a different scale, with all kinds of different effects. In terms of the influence of the relationship with non-human agents, that's an interesting one. Like while I was in the highlands, they were afflicted by an invasion of wild pigs. I guess it's not surprising because, first of all, there were always wild pigs invading their cornfields, but because very few people were now planting food crops, the pigs were rather concentrated, and the attacks were rather problematic, or more problematic than usual. And so they decided to hold a ceremony for the spirits of the earth and the water, to see if they could kind of set matters right with the spirit world. And as they tried to assemble the tray of offerings, they realized that actually nobody had any corn to add to the tray of offerings. They didn't even have the right crops to place on the offering tray. And then someone, detailed a neighbor to hike down to the market and buy some corn so that they could put some corn on the tray, right? So, here you have people trying to adapt a set of practices and interactions with the spirit world, which pertained to a certain set of productive practices, but somehow did not seem to quite fit with the world of cacao. And I asked them, I said, well, so why don't you put some cacao on the tray? Like, that's what you're growing now. Maybe the spirits of the earth and the water, are interested in the full feast. That's what you're growing, put it there too. And they said, no, that didn't feel quite right either, because as they said, cacao is just for money. So, these are uneasy sets of relations as people are changing their perspective on the environment and on their production. One thing was actually part of a debate that I've had with Mario Blazer and others has to do with the pragmatic relationship to the spirit world. In fact, Marisol, like, I don't know what, said we should sit down over a bottle of wine and just really figure out what are the differences between us. Like, why is it that I see a world, or I portray a world, which is not dominated by respect for nature, or in the same way as the Andean worlds that she has described, and that Mario also describes. what I have found is people adopting a highly pragmatic relationship to the spirit world. So, you know, they want to cut down a tree because they want to expand their cocoa. They believe that tree is full of spirits. Well, the proper thing to do is to call on someone who knows the right language to communicate with the spirits, prepare a tree of offerings, and ask this intermediary to invite the spirits to vacate that tree and move to another one so that they can cut down the one that they need, right? And they assume that the spirits will be open to such a pragmatic thinking. Like, we too need to live. Look, guys, we've provided a whole feast for you in this tray of offerings. You know, we're not suggesting that you should have nothing, but we would just convenient, you know, like, you, it would be more convenient if you would move from this tree and move to this other one, because the one where you're living right now, we need to cut it down. And they assumed that the spirits would in fact comply with this, or at least they were worth inviting. And if bad things happened, children died, or, you know, someone got injured, that was a sign that the bargain had failed, you know, that the spirits were not in fact happy with the deal. And if nothing bad happened, or within a certain period of time, you know, these interpretations, as we know, are always mobile. If nothing too bad happened, then, you know, then it was okay. So it is a world populated by spirits, but these are not spirits which necessarily stand in the way of human plans, right? These are spirits with whom deals can be struck and arrangements can be made, and there's a kind of a testing as to whether or not these arrangements are acceptable, but they don't govern human relations in the same way that people talking about Andean spirits and the landscape, or in Mario's case in the Chaco, become figures that kind of dictate what humans can and can't do. So the question is, are we just dealing with different kinds of spirits here, different kinds of people and different kinds of spirits? Or is it just that I'm a lousy anthropologist and I don't pay enough attention to, you know, what the spirits are saying or doing? I think we are dealing with actually different concepts of the spirit world, and that we have to be open to that, right? I mean, I think there's been a desire to find in these kind of other than human creatures and relations something redemptive, or something solid, you know, something which will guide people along pathways of environmental sustainability. And in some places, yes, and in other places, they really don't work like that. So we have to be prepared to recognize it. So I think this question of, the second question of the difficulties that activists face and the risks we present to our interlocutors. So, I mean, you're right, Catherine, that's a big one. Many people have kind of worried over this. I've always been, thinking back to Sherry Ortner's essay on what she called ethnographic refusal. You know, why was it that literature on social movements was ethnographically so thin? And often she felt it was because of ethnographers kind of monitoring themselves, you know, not wanting to air their dirty laundry, not wanting to get into too much of the complexity and too many of the preserve what they understood as an important narrative, you know, which should be left intact. Like, don't mess there, don't go there, don't talk about those things. It's not necessary. Many other topics. So I've wrestled with this continuously, and I've had a long-running engagement with people in Indonesian social movements, and I would say that my interlocutors are of two kinds, right? You know, one group would rather anthropologists like me just disappear. You know, don't do this work because it interrupts narratives about that they want to promote. You know, narratives about as you put it, you know, alternative politics, which create spaces, which, you know, enable more hopeful scenarios. And they think that me and others like me are a problem. And another group who actually take the opposite view. And, you know, at one point, really to my amazement, some of the leaders of Indonesia's indigenous movement asked me to be their advisor. And I said, what, me? Like, I'm always on your case. Like, why me of all people? I always give you a hard time, you know, and they said, well, that's why, because if we cannot answer the questions that you are raising and the kinds of questions that you are asking, we shouldn't be running this movement, right? So there are social movement activists, and in this case, indigenous activists and social movements who are so overwhelmingly aware of the complexity of the situations that they are dealing with, that they're not actually looking for a repetition of a simplified yet hopeful narrative, but with a serious discussion about those complexities, ways of understanding them, and ways to work upon them, you know, constructively and collaboratively, including with foreign scholars, and with their critics, right? And so that's a different approach, right? One which says that what is sometimes, you know, described as strategic simplifications are actually not that strategic if they end up with exaggerated narratives which are poorly relate to the kind of rural situation that many people are in the context in which they work. So I think that's a question, like, how strategic is it to reproduce narratives which wish away all of the, or some of the complexity and the challenges that actual movement organizing requires. So I think that is, you know, everyone has to feel their way with that. And my own sense is that, first of all, I haven't worked directly with movements, so I haven't been, you know, directly implicated in that. But I felt the position that I have taken, you asked me how it's kind of affected my work, is that, you know, I should do my job as a scholar. That's what I'm good at. You know, I'm a researcher. I know how to write. I know how to analyze. I'm very alert to the potential political implications of my work, but I feel that that it should be out there and people can do with it what they will. I don't claim to have the last word on anything. If my work has been useful for activism, that's great. I intend it to be useful, but I don't control that. And you know, I would say so far so good. You know, I don't think I've caused enormous harm, and I think that it has been a kind of a contribution to these really challenging ongoing issues that the people are dealing with in Indonesia, particularly, but across Southeast Asia. So I do aim to create space, but not in quite this way of like for the way that you're describing it, like for an alter politics. My way of creating space, I suppose, is more along the lines of, well, let's dive into this situation and try to understand it. And then it would be good to think with, you know, we'll create space for reflection, space for comparison, perhaps. Why is it like that there? And why is it different here? How might that offer different sets of possibilities? That's the kind of space that I've tried to create by putting work out there and seeing what people do with it. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. Gabriel, do you?
Yes,
Yeah.
I had some questions, but Catherine already anticipated many of the aspects I wanted to discuss. Yeah, maybe I can ask a question and then give the possibility to the others also to ask their questions. One of my ideas, I don't know if it's a question or personal reflection, was about why the people do critics or do not critics. So you very clearly mentioned that in several of your field work, there is no NGOs or organic intellectuals or researchers that can enable the people to perceive the gaps, diachronic transformation, to make it very short, and eventually to provide them some elements of comparison and of articulation. Sometimes also the critics doesn't emerge or articulate because there are some material compensations. And also development actors' narrative are sometimes stronger than local political imaginations, and even they are incorporated in these imaginations. So another factor that I had in mind was that the world order for, in many cases, for the people is more important than and real in their eyes than the world order that they presume to be intended by the actors of development. I think, for example, of contexts in which the political order isn't the main element that structures the cosmology, in comparison, for example, to the ritual order or to the relationship with ancestors or the elements and entities of the environment. In other words, as far as the social cohesion or fundamental values are perceived as safe, there is no need for mobilization. So maybe one of the reasons of the non-articulation is in this unperception and in those non-political factors. So based on your observation on the fieldwork, do you think that this kind of ontologic or at least representational factor is relevant as a cause of non-articulation? I don't know if my question is clear enough to you.
Really, I have to say, but I just caught the last part. You're suggesting a sort of a division between the cosmological order, or what you're calling fundamental values, and other domains of, let's say, political organization of the state or that kind of thing, right? That these are separate domains, and that's. Are you suggesting that so long as people perceive what you call their fundamental values to be safe, they're not that engaged by the other stuff? Is that what you're suggesting?
As long as their world order is safe, a world order where politics is not at the center of the social life, for example, they don't need the urgency of politically mobilizing. And if the transformation are progressive, and they are embedded in a set of larger transformations, maybe people don't feel that their world order is under threat. So that's why they don't need the field to mobilize.
I mean, you know, I find it difficult to kind of separate out this idea of what are fundamental values, right? I mean, in both the scenarios that I described, you'd say that people's, that the every aspect of life, and actually the cosmological as well, was drastically altered. There's nothing stable there. You know, look at that landscape of dead palms, like whatever the spirits were doing before, it sure isn't the same now. And every aspect of social relations, intergenerational transmission of knowledge and property and community, like everything is transformed. There's nothing safe there. And yet, you know, people don't just curl up into a little ball and die. You know, anomie is actually surprisingly rare. Like, despite massively transformed landscapes like that and drastically altered lives, most remarkably, people still seem to find ways to sustain social relations, and in some forms sustain relations with various kinds of spirit worlds as well, like even under drastically transformed conditions. So I wouldn't say that's because their fundamental values are safe, although maybe, you know, we'll end up, perhaps the difference between us is not that great, in the sense that I look at a ruined landscape, but do people get up in the morning and make breakfast and send their kids to school and, you know, worry about their daughter who's off in the city and might get pregnant? And, you know, I mean, ordinary life stuff, you know, does continue even in ruined landscapes. You know, we know this from how refugees somehow manage to produce everyday life, you know, even under extraordinary duress. So I don't know this idea that like, because everything is somehow okay, therefore people don't mobilize quite is going to help us, right? Because people will always find, well, it seems even under extraordinary conditions, find ways to create meaning in their everyday life. But it doesn't mean that things are okay. It doesn't mean that therefore there is nothing about this picture which makes you uncomfortable, right? So perhaps we need a sort of, you know, a scalar question of what is the level of unease. And perhaps, I mean, you could be right that some dimensions will bother people more than others, but for me that then becomes a sort of the empirical question, like what is it that makes you uncomfortable? What is the structure of power that you have identified? Is it the fact that somebody with an axe is cutting down the spirit trees that makes you uncomfortable? Or are you quite fine with that, and what makes you uncomfortable is something else, right? It's the fact that you cannot even buy your kid a pair of shoes and they can't go to school and they're going to grow up illiterate like you, and you think that's absolutely appalling. It's not what you would like for your children. So being kind of flexible, you know, using that apparatus that I suggested to identify the structure of power that makes people uncomfortable could be a way to address this, I think, this question that you're posing. You know.
Yes, and in many cases, the mobilization occur because there is a feeling of injustice, that is a feeling of abnormal inequality. And sometimes historical or anthropological accounts make appear these injustices. So when the people with which you made your investigation read your books and your work, did they make some comments about this, the gaps that you made appear through your ethnography? Does it have an impact on the felt injustice?
Well, first of all, none of the people that have been my interlocutors have read this book, have read these books because they can't read Indonesian. Even though I've translated all my work and it's all available in Indonesian, some of them cannot read it, and or would not, you know, we're talking a big gulf in terms of levels of education and so on. But so it's not whether people have read my work, but what I did mention was that when I have raised these topics for discussion, and you know, I always try to do that in a way which doesn't overdetermine the answer, right? I don't ask people, you know, I try to use those as opportunities to find out what it is that makes people uncomfortable in an open-ended way. Like, what is the thing that they're worried about when they look at a scene like those dead palms, or, you know, when they notice that some people in the Laoje Highlands have become landless. Like, does that bother them or does it not? And if it doesn't, why not, right? What makes it ordinary for them in such a way that it does not create a sense of unease? So for me, these are all lines of empirical inquiry, right? Rather than kind of fixed points that I would identify. I think that for me, that's what's interesting about this field and this approach, right? Is that you can actually be open to what it is that makes people uncomfortable. And it could be something that I had never even imagined, you know. It could be because there's no fish in the river, or it could be they're fine with no fish in the river, but what really bothers them is that the guy next door has become, you know, vastly rich, and you now feel embarrassed to go into his house, you know, like what it is that makes people feel uncomfortable, whether it's inequality or fish in the river. I'm open to that, right? Let's see. Yeah.
Thank you, Tania, for considering our questions, even when they are not very well formulated, in my case. I would like to give the opportunity to Kasia Alexic to formulate her question. Please, Kasia. No, you are still on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, I'm from France. I'm actually trying to finish a PhD on women movements and peasant movements in Indonesia. I found it so interesting what you said about, I mean, the angle of working, of tackling palm oil through work. That was my first point. I think it's very, very crucial today because we tend to speak a lot about palm oil and environmental issues, but it is a work issue and a major work issue. And there's been some narratives speaking about palm oil and having good life conditions under it. And I think it's very important to stress the issue that actually it is very uncomfortable and very, yeah, that the inequalities are being felt very strongly also there. And on this thing, I had a first question is that you speak about the lack of organization of workers. Actually, that in my fieldwork, I've seen that there are trade unions that are being organized in palm oil, but also among factories in Indonesia. And there's been actually a massive spread of trade unions. Lots of them have been called yellow unions, but recently there's also been, with the omnibus law, strong criticism about these yellow unions, and there's been strong narratives of socialist and the communist past and the feminist past, or the Gerwani movement in Indonesia. And what I've seen is that there is also this that's happening. And I feel that as a researcher role, it's important also to underline that this brutal authoritarian state movement that has been so destructive is actually from below. There is new movements creating these new imaginaries. So my first question is, why do you say that there is no trade unions? And my second question is also that I actually agree to say that there are places where there is strong social movements, trade unions, but there are these completely emptied places where there is nothing left to complete desolation. And my question, and it's also based on my field work, is I was starting actually in a place with palm oils, and I didn't find the political movements where I expected to. It wasn't through trade union form in the plantations, because indeed it was judged as being too dangerous, and even the spontaneous actions, it was just bringing more criminalization for the people. But there was a local political organization that was living with the people, getting trust with them. There was a land that was being opened. They were trying to persuade workers not to work in palm oils, but to work on this other land. And there was education, and there was even Marxist education going on. So there is this kind of alternative movements that are being built where we don't expect them. So I guess with this, my question is how do our analytical framework can also influence what we're looking for? And I also wanted to raise the issue of ideology. I think it's important to think about it not only in the Indonesian context, but on a global context where we tend not to think political movements anymore through class struggles or with this Marxist inspiration with what it's the way it's being reinvented today. But yeah, so it's questions and comments. I hope this is clear and useful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kasia. So, I mean, I have read work written over the last 10 years based on field work of other people in other parts, particularly one study in Sumatra that followed very closely an emergent new union. And what the study showed was that there were periods of optimism in which the union seemed to be making headway, signing up new members. And then as soon as things seemed to be becoming effective, there was a massive repression of eviction and people losing their jobs, being chased out and attacked and so on. So the effort to reunionize is really, I'm not saying that it never happens, but I think there are repeated efforts, and it is viciously repressed. And so, you know, it's if what you've been tracking is a new front of mobilization, that's great. As you know, there are 12 million hectares of plantations, and you know, I would hazard a guess that the percentage of people actually protected by a union of workers is probably 1 or 2% at the moment, right? If you compare that to what the unions were doing in Sumatra in the 50s, the plantation workers were the most unionized group. The plantation workers union, Sabupri, was the biggest union in the country, had more members than any of the manufacturing or other unions, and was very effective at pressuring for worker rights, including rights for the surrounding villages. They became so effective that they were viciously repressed by the army and by the attacks of 1965, right? Which were vicious precisely against unions because they were so effective, because they were an effective counterforce. So I think definitely wherever something, I mean, I'm all in favor of studying sites. You know, I said I'm looking at sites where nothing is happening as one front. I think some of the work that you guys are doing, studying fronts where something is happening, you know, where there is some new movement, some new unionization, something like that, is also very important. And then there, what I always want to know is like, what are the enabling conditions? What is it that is enabling this to happen in this time, in this place? What is the conjuncture? What are the social forces? Like what's happening in regional politics? Is there some local politician who's providing what the Indonesians call an umbrella, some sort of protection for an emergent union for some reason? Like, I think it's each of these have to be understood on their own terms, and there's lessons to learn from where things are not happening and also from where things are happening about the conditions that enable them, the challenges that they encounter, and the whole that also seems to me important. In the places where there are no unions, like the places where we've been working, the language of class struggle is strikingly absent. No one talks really in these terms. And I think these terms are largely unavailable to them, right? They have not really had a concept that workers could mobilize against the corporation. What they've been fed for 30 years under the new order is the idea that, you know, a corporation is a family and that workers and the nation are part of, you know, this kind of familistic ideology is heavily promulgated in Indonesia in general and including in plantation zones. And the alternative languages, which suggest that actually, no, we're not one family, we are opposed social groups with opposed interest. That is a language which has been pretty radically suppressed, and where it bubbles up again, that's interesting to note, right? Like what is enabling people to recapture and to recreate this mode of articulation? Definitely something to be followed. Right. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, so we are already running on time. It's already 16:36. Professor Tania, do you want us to continue for a few minutes, or?
I mean, I'm willing. If it doesn't upset your conference schedule, I'll do whatever you like. I'm here.
No, it's the last session of the day, and we are very happy to have you there. So.
Okay. Sure.
So,
absolutely. Yeah. Let's continue. It's fine.
So first, I would like to read a comment from Professor Singh, and after that, I will ask a question from somebody from the audience. So Professor Singh just comments that a call out to Craig Etherington's new book, Government of Beans, where he explores what happens in Paraguay in a small moment when a progressive government tries, without much success alas, to do something about the spread of soy plantations with their displacement of peasants and the spread of toxic chemicals. He shows us the small hurdles that block what Ibu Tania has just called the making of new worlds. So it's a useful comment. Thank you so much. I would like also to read the question of Venda, who is a worker at Lingkar untuk Pembaruan Desa dan Agraria. So it's a circle for the renewal of the countryside and agriculture. She asked, how do you see the relation between the indigenous people and transmigrants in plantation area in accordance to build social movement alliance between workers for both of them? As I know, even before 1945, some labor unions were divided by ethnicity or race. Now, when identity politics is rising up and the awakening of indigenous people is still ongoing, maybe it's incomplete, how do you see this possibility under the current situation? So what is the possibility for them to forge alliance, if I'm not wrong?
Mm-hmm.
If it's not clear enough for you, Tania,
No,
maybe...
that's fine. I'm just looking at the written version of the comments as well. Right. So Venda's question first about the kind of identity politics. I don't know if you could even call that, but the problem with the transmigrants. This is really very challenging in the area where our research has been conducted does involve transmigrants, and the local Malay and Dayak population regard the transmigrants as part of the occupying force, right? They are people who have come in and occupied their land, supported by the government and the plantation corporation, under terms which the locals feel are drastically unfair and which were based on a completely misunderstanding of the Kalimantan landscape and the understanding that locals had huge areas of unused or underused land which could be taken over by both the core plantation and the transmigrants. And somehow the locals could spare all this land, you know, and did not need to be compensated or recognized. So you could say that from the very founding of a transmigration scheme connected to a plantation, a line of antagonism is very sharply sown. And it does make people feel greatly uneasy. So again, at a personal level, there are a few examples where transmigrants and locals have, you know, been neighborly, like they're not necessarily fighting each other. There've also been on both sides, facing people away and so on. So I think that the problem is that the basis of transmigration is what we are arguing in our book is a kind of a colonial assumption of terra nullius, right? It's an assumption that the land is vast and empty. The locals don't know how to use it correctly because they are hopeless farmers, they are backward people. And therefore you need plantation corporations to come in to do modern production, and you need transmigrants who are assumed to be, you know, more efficient, harder working people who will somehow create productive landscapes here where the natives failed to do that. Now, the natives in this case can't help but see this as a thoroughly colonial situation, all right? They've been occupied by a plantation and associated transmigrants bearing a colonial language which treats them as hopeless cases, as people who cannot do things on their own, who do not know how to make landscapes productive, and who cannot engage in modern production on their own. So the whole premise is so insulting and so damaging that you could say it, you know, it sets locals and transmigrants off on a really bad foot. And it's very hard to see how you recover from that, right? What kind of articulation would be necessary to shift the grounds of alliance there, so that, let us say, you know, local and transmigrant farmers might agree that their enemy is the corporation, and that they, as ordinary people and farmers, all of them attempting to secure a good livelihood for their families, that they are actually quite similar to each other, you know, in a similar class position, one could say, and that the other is not the transmigrant family next door, but the corporation. You know, all things are possible, right? That kind of articulation and connection is in theory possible. In practice, it's really made challenging by the colonial premise of transmigration, of bringing all these people in on the assumption that the locals have land to spare and cannot farm.
Tania, there is a small
So
problem.
it's really it's a difficult one.
Small problem with your
In
micro.
the area. Oh, really?
Just
okay.
For a few seconds. So we did not hear the last sentence. Sorry.
Okay. So, you know, the language of indigeneity is not very available in the area where we've been working. People don't describe themselves that way, but they just use a banal language, you know, orang setempat, like people who were here first, you know, we are the people from here, they are the newcomers. It's that kind of rough and ready sense of, you know, we have some rights here. We were here first. We were farming this land before these other people came. But they haven't connected up with indigenous rights to articulate a sense of indigeneity politically. You know, they're dealing with the fact that there's a plantation on their land and the fact that there is a whole load of transmigrants on their land, you know, there with government permission and with corporate support. And that's a problem for them, but they have not really articulated, one could say, that an indigenous positioning thus far. You know, the unions in the 50s, as you were mentioning, you know, after 45, even before 45, but in the 50s, according to Palsa's work and Anstola's work on the plantations in Sumatra, the unions were very successful, or were successfully working at bridging this divide by including in their mobilization strategies, not just the rights of workers on the plantations, but also the rights of people living around the plantations, whether they were the former residents, you could say the indigenous people of the place, or ex-plantation workers. So basically encompassing the plantation and its surroundings under one organizational framework guided by the Plantation Workers Union, working together with the Farmers Union, the BTI. They were overcoming those divides, you know, which are built into the plantation landscape. I have not seen that happening since. Not to say it's impossible, but I haven't seen it so far. Anna's question. Hi, Anna. It's twice now in the last month where we've met online, indirectly. On Craig, yes, Craig Hetherington's book. Call out to Craig, definitely, who has written a second brilliant book. His first one was also amazing, called The Government of Beans, which I've also read, although it was some time ago. But I don't know quite, you know, Anna's point here, it's perhaps, I'm going to ventriloquize, he's taken a progressive moment. So he's an anthropologist here in Canada, in Concordia, he's taken a progressive moment where a group of actually technocrats, people involved in making environmental law around the government, around soy farming, tried to do something amazing, you know, tried to institute new rules to, you know, govern the toxic chemicals, to secure land rights. And he's really asking, what were they trying to do? What made it possible for them to, at least for a period of time, be on to something which looked like it had prospects, transformational prospects? And as he says, you know, disappointingly, it didn't get very far, but these are what I would call, you know, conjunctures, hopeful conjunctures, which are worth studying, because the question for me in reading something like that is, well, what made it possible? What were the conditions of possibility which enabled a group of sort of activist scientists and environmentalists, like, get something going there, which for a while looked quite hopeful and like it might actually change the conditions of soy farming in Paraguay. It didn't get that far. The government changed, this group disbanded, etc. But these moments are worth studying because, first of all, it makes us realize that it's not always this, it's not always hopeless, and or it's not always the same. You know, the conditions of possibility shift in different historical moments. I have not worked in such an optimistic time and place. But I think Cassia, for example, you know, it looks like you are working in an optimistic time and place where it feels like something is moving and something is happening and something is possible. So that definitely is worth recording, you know, narrating and reflecting on, you know, what is making that possible at this moment.
There was a question from Venda who earlier asked you a question, and she wanted to provide a short testimony about her experience of research in at West Kalimantan. Venda has a problem with her camera, but do you want to talk?
Yes, I want to talk. Thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon, Bu Tania.
Hello.
I'm Veda. I was a student at Cultural Anthropology UGM. I did my research with Mas Pujo in West Kalimantan. My focus, more research focus is the totem transformation in West Kalimantan after palm oil introduction. But I found an interesting part there, like when I visit Malay, when my Dayak friends, both of them are worker, they saw their bitterness toward the Japanese people, the Japanese transmigrant. Literally, they say they stole our land, but they never told it directly to the Japanese people, to the transmigrant. From this conversation, I can see that actually, but Malay and Dayak have sentiment towards the transmigrant. It's clear, but in the future, like you say, it's quite hard to make alliance between the transmigrant and the indigenous person in the local people, because now when I work as a researcher in Karsa with Bagian Dosa Karya, then we did some evaluation and research toward agrarian reform under the Jokowi program in Pulang Pisau and then Sigi. We found that some indigenous people exclude the transmigrant that live around them from agrarian reform scheme from Jokowi. Like Jokowi has land tenurial rights from the indigenous people. Jokowi will give them title, but they also say that the transmigrant village is actually our land, it's not theirs. So Jokowi needs to give title to them, not the transmigrant. Even the transmigrant is also poor. So I think it's interesting discussion when we can see how the relation between the indigenous people and the indigeneity politics and the transmigrant towards plantation, towards their relation to the agrarian reform policy. You can say it's not agrarian reform policy because there's no tuan tanah in the law under the Jokowi. But it's interesting to see how the politics of claim.
Mm.
I say it, how the politics of claim between both of them. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Venda. So you're raising a really interesting question. We discussed this a bit in our book, Power's Exclusion, in the chapter on agrarian movements, where it really is a huge dilemma, not just in Indonesia, also in the Philippines and other places which have a plantation history, where the people, when land reform comes along, the people who have been workers on the plantation, sometimes across multiple generations, feel that when the land is going to be distributed under land reform, they, as the people who have lived and worked and raised their families there, deserve a share. Whereas the indigenous people around there say, this was our land before the plantation took it. Therefore, it is for us to use and perhaps also for us to decide who should have a share. Whether the workers on the plantation will be included or not is for us to determine, because after all, it is our land. It was always our land before it was stolen from us. So this question of land reform and whether it should be based on the class principle of either land to the tiller or land to the landless versus a platform which foregrounds the principle of whose was it first, who is actually has the historical jurisdiction over this territory, is actually coming up all over Southeast Asia as these different principles collide. And I would say that nowhere is there a very simple resolution to that question. These are really two different, one could say, two different frames of justice. And people who adopt a class perspective, including some of my colleagues in the agrarian movement in Sulawesi, talk about the indigenous principle, or as one of them once said, it's like the disease of indigenism. It's a disease in the sense that it infects you if you think that the only principle of justice is who was here first. That's a horrible way or a hopeless way of thinking about justice for the future. But from another perspective, that's a completely valid position, right? It's our land. It's for us, not necessarily to monopolize it all, but for us to resume jurisdiction so that it is for us to decide, in negotiation perhaps with our neighbors, including migrants and former plantation workers, what will be the way of organizing access to land and resources in this place. But the first step is land back. So, I'm here in Canada where our indigenous movements are voicing very clearly this claim for what they call land back. That's the founding principle has to be restoring their authority and jurisdiction over the land. Only then can they be can they overcome this colonial situation in which they are still living. And then when they have their land back, they will make the rules, which might in fact be extremely reasonable ones, but it's for them to decide and for them to do, right? This is a principle that many national governments find absolutely intolerable. The idea that you will have sub-nations who have recovered authority and jurisdiction is a very scary idea for many national governments, which is why they're not getting it right for the most part.
We will close after Tania gives the possibility to do that. It will be her who will give us the start to close. But first, I would like to give the floor to Marie Rasselis to make a comment. And after that, Tania, you can answer and we'll finish the session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I came in late, unfortunately, but I've been following at least half of that and the discussion. But it's this last point that you make that I find very interesting, because if there's a situation in the Philippines, as you know, we have the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. So it's very clear that if each indigenous group goes through the process and actually gets a land status that they own the land, then it's very clear that they have the right to do it, and they're supported by law, more or less. But I think that may help resolve a little bit your point about uh, that they, in some other cases, maybe Indonesia or other countries, they still have to make the point that, we were here first. In the Philippines, that point has been made, even though it may not always be followed. But the organizing of indigenous peoples has been very strong on that score. But what I've seen, I haven't really tracked what happens on plantations, but I know communities in which, the lowland people have been moving in and taking farm places for a long time. And once people get their land established, that the IPA, that they have the right, that the law recognizes what they always believed, then they get into a negotiation or in the process with those who have stayed. I'm not sure of what all the determinants are, but I know that if they have gotten along with those farmers, small farmers, where Tagalog is not indigenous, or Cebuanos or whatever, the major uh, linguistic groups, that more or less they say, well, leave it alone. Yeah, you stay there. You are really part of here. Your children have grown up here. So there's a kind of a give and take there. And the dynamics at community level becomes very strong because you're right. They know they have the right. So it's kind of their generosity maybe, or recognition that these farmers are contributing certain things which maybe they themselves don't do or don't want to do. Maybe the lowland farmers probably have better connections with uh, outside sources that lend money or provide other resources. So they have a function in the community often which indigenous people originally don't particularly care to do. This goes along with your lovely comment about studying places where, quote, nothing is happening versus where something is happening. And maybe these kinds of areas is where something is happening, but it fits in with their cultural context. They're learning how to live with others. But since the others have accepted more or less that they're neighbors in some way, then it's all right. Plantations, I don't know. That may be something quite different. But in other words, to show that there is such variation in this issue. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Mary, that's really fascinating. And I whenever my colleagues in Indonesia are talking about indigenous rights, I always ask them or suggest that they read the literature on the Philippines, because you're so much further ahead in terms of implementing the Indigenous Rights Act. And so you have a lot of experience with how these things actually work out on the ground, as you were mentioning. And that's really crucial, right? Because that's where you go from the level of abstraction as to what would recognition of indigenous territories mean as a theory, and how this can actually be worked out practically on the ground, sometimes with good results, sometimes with a violent result. But this is there's so much material in the Philippines where this has already taken place over the last couple of decades. So I think that's really a good point. One small point about the Philippines that has always struck me is that the level of the scale of indigenous territories is quite large. It's often at the level of a whole barangay or a whole, what in Indonesia would be a district. So they're not talking about small communities on small areas. They're talking about already complex territories with many different people living there with different histories and engagements. So working all that out, while keeping indigenous principles in mind and jurisdictions in mind, is a huge, long, complex political process. And I think there's so much to be learned from the Philippines example. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you. If Mary, you have no other comment,
No, that's right.
Thank you so much, Mary. Professor Mary Rasselis, also who is professor in Ateneo de Manila University and also in University of the Philippines. So thank you so much, Tania. Do you want to add something, or can I finish?
No, not at all. Just to thank you for organizing this and for giving me the opportunity. I hope I've responded somewhat to the questions. You know, if I haven't caught all the points, I'm sure these are things you'll come back to as you present your papers over the coming days. Yeah, basically, thank you for inviting me here, and enjoy your discussions in the days to come.
Thank you so much, Tania Lee, for all this intellectual food and material to meditate. Thank you also, Catherine, for discussing the keynote address. And thank you, of course, to my colleague, Gloria Trulli-Estrelita, who is co-organizer, and our technical assistant, Eduardo Erlanga. So we will meet again with you tomorrow for panel 4A, 4B, 5, and 7. And it will be about political participation, another one about material production, and another one about how people cope with COVID-19 related issues. So thank you so much, and have a nice day, and see you tomorrow for the conference.
Okay. Bye.